To introduce our speaker. Joe Loconte is the director of the Rivendell Center in New York City. He is a presidential scholar of New York College of Florida and the C.S. Lewis Scholar for Public Life at Grove City College. He serves as a senior fellow at Founding Forward. Dr. Loconte's commentary on religion and public life appears in the nation's leading journals and newspapers, including the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and Washington Post. He's the author of the New York Times bestseller, A Hobbit, A Wardrobe, and the Great War, How J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis rediscovered faith, friendship, and heroism in the cataclysm of 1914 to 1918. And tonight, we'll hear about his follow-up book, The War for Middle-earth, J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis Confront the Gathering Storm, 1933 to 1945. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Joe Loconte.
Get myself wide for sound here. Okay, can you hear me back there in the bleacher seats? Pretty good, yeah? Good? Well, thank you. Incredible hospitality of Founding Forward and Union League. Thank you, everybody, for coming out. I didn't know there were so many closet hobbits out there. Great to see you guys coming out. You know, we don't have anybody alive today that I'm aware of who fought in the First World War and then had to endure a Second World War. I do have some grandparents, though. They're no longer with us, but my maternal grandfather, Giuseppe Aiello, for whom I'm named, Joseph Aiello, he left Italy in 1921, a year before Mussolini was swept into power. My paternal grandfather, Michael Loconte, he was living in the United States during the outbreak of the First World War, and the Italians want him to fight in the Italian army. The Americans say, fight for us. If you survive, we'll put you on a fast track to citizenship. I think Grandpa Loconte thought about that for about 10 seconds and said, I'll fight for the Americans. He did. He fought at the Meuse-Argonne, survived. They settled in Brooklyn, and here we are. How about a round of applause for the grandparents? Amazing. All right, let's get into it. Halfway through the First World War, November 30th, 1916, a group of European leaders attend the funeral of Franz Joseph, ruler over the Austro-Hungarian Empire. In a ceremony scripted by the emperor before his death, the grand cortege carrying the coffin halts outside the Capuchin monastery in Vienna, where all the Habsburg emperors were laid to rest. And what transpired now was a whisper from an earlier era, a nod to the transcendence of God and the frailty of men. The herald on behalf of the emperor knocks on the monastery door. Who is knocking? Shouts the abbot inside. I am Franz Joseph, Emperor of Austria, King of Hungary. I don't know you. Again, the herald shouts, I'm Franz Joseph, Emperor of Austria, King of Hungary, Bohemia, Galicia, Dalmatia, Grand Duke of Transylvania, Duke of... We still don't know who you are, interrupts the abbot. At this moment, the herald falls on his knees and in front of all the assembled declares, I am Franz Joseph, a poor sinner, humbly begging God's mercy. Enter then, the abbot says, and the gates open. The funeral of the Austro-Hungarian emperor symbolized an outlook already in an advanced stage of decay. Settled beliefs about the religious dimension to human life were becoming unsettled. Assumptions about the moral life, about the existence of good and evil, seemed to have vanished into the killing fields of 1914, 1918. By the end of that war, the emotional and spiritual lives of millions of ordinary Europeans are caught up in what you might call a no man's land of doubt and disillusionment. The war unleashed a storm of murderous ideologies. Fascism, communism, Nazism, totalitarianism. And the terrible result is a Second World War, the most devastating war in human history. Well, two of the most influential writers of the 20th century, J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, were caught up in the fire and the fury of these conflicts. Both men were soldiers in the British military in the trenches in France during the First World War. Barely 20 years later, they must endure a second global conflict. We cannot begin to understand their astonishing achievements as authors until we enter into their world, friends, a world in crisis. And the moment we do this, we begin to see how the long shadows cast by the Second World War invaded their minds and imaginations. We begin to see that much of what they wrote and taught was a deliberate rebuke, yes, a rebuke to the spirit of the age, a rebuke to cynicism, to the lies, to the propaganda, to the hatreds, the lust for power that darkened the lives of millions of people. I could put my thesis in 3 words: war, friendship, and imagination. It's the tragedy of war that brought these 2 men together in friendship. And it's their friendship that makes possible the creation of their great imaginative works. Together they staged what you might call a rebellion, a literary revolt against the spirit of the age. That's the big picture. Now, let's unpack it. We're in the Oxford Union, where a debate is being held February 9th, 1933. A motion is put forward for a vote. This House will under no circumstances fight for its king and country. You can see that quotation right there on your quote page, ladies and gentlemen. This House will in no circumstances fight for its king and country. The motion known as the Oxford Oath is approved, friends, approved by a vote of 275 to 153. What do we make of that? Think about it. Never in the long history of Great Britain had a generation of future leaders among the best educated in the Western world publicly renounced any obligation to defend their nation in wartime. It's never happened before. And their timing couldn't have been worse. It could be argued that 1933 is the year in which the liberal democratic project in the West begins to unravel. 1933. The year when Woodrow Wilson's dream of a new world order based on the brotherhood of man starts to dissolve, when naked aggression goes unchallenged, when mass murder is committed with impunity. It's the year when much of the democratic West, including the United States, turns its back on the truth. When Franklin Roosevelt arrives in office in 1933, the United States is in the throes of the Great Depression, right? FDR promises to solve the nation's economic woes, proclaiming that, quote, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Well, there are other things to fear. Excuse me. There we go. Militarism in Asia. Japan, under the leadership of the supposedly divine Emperor Hirohito, is waging war against China. Animated by a vision of racial purity, the Japanese leadership has created a military state with one overriding objective: the complete territorial domination of Asia. January 1st, 1933, Japan launches a fresh attack along the Great Wall in the Rihe province, and the Japanese proceed to bomb civilian populations in almost every major city in China. 2 months later, Japan quits the League of Nations. What else is there to fear? In the Soviet Union, mass starvation, political violence. Under the dictatorship of Joseph Stalin, the communist regime is engaged in a campaign of extermination against its peasant population. Stalin's policy of collectivization, and we're hearing that word again, friends, from the mayor of New York City, by the way, collectivization, we'll see how that works out, has created a famine of biblical proportions. By the spring of 1933, at least 5 million people are dead, millions more on the brink of starvation. In Ukraine, and think about this with the war against Ukraine being waged right now by Russia. In Ukraine, once the breadbasket of the Soviet Union, the famine is killing 25,000 people a day. Opponents of Stalin's policies are sent to concentration camps. What else is there to fear? In Italy, Benito Mussolini, the fascist dictator swept into power in 1922, is determined to restore Italian greatness on the world stage. By 1933, Mussolini is secretly drawing up plans to invade Ethiopia, making it a colonial possession. And then, of course, there's Nazi Germany. January 30th, 1933, barely 10 days before the Oxford Union Society vote, Adolf Hitler is elevated to chancellor, making him the second most powerful person in the country. 2 days later, he dissolves parliament. The German government now is led by a man who had announced his intention to tear up the Treaty of Versailles, rebuild the military, pursue a policy of territorial expansion. Now, why do I mention all of that? Because it's at this moment, in 1933, the start of an unprecedented assault on the moral norms of Western civilization, that J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis engaged their literary talents to try to hold the line. Oops. Now, we don't know exactly when Tolkien started writing The Hobbit, but he completed the first draft in early 1933. The story's protagonist, Bilbo Baggins, lives in Bag End, the underground home in the village of Hobbiton. He likes to mind his own business. But one day he's visited by the wizard named Gandalf, 13 dwarves, driven out of their homes by a dragon named Smaug. And so Bilbo is thrust into this dangerous adventure, right? But along the way, he acquires a ring that allows him to become invisible. Now, a distinguishing trait of Bilbo Baggins is courage. Courage, but not the sort of courage that you find in classical or medieval epics. Bilbo was filled with self-doubt. His battles are usually internal, should he risk exposing himself to danger to help the company. He's a modern hero, friends, isn't he? He's a modern hero. But he does face deadly enemies. Take a look at your quote sheet if you like. He faces deadly enemies. Listen to Tolkien's description in The Hobbit. Now, goblins are cruel, wicked, and bad-hearted. They make no beautiful things, but they make many clever ones. Hammers, axes, swords, daggers, pickaxes, tongs, instruments of torture. They make them very well. It is not unlikely that they invented some of the machines that have since troubled the world, especially the ingenious devices for killing large numbers of people at once. For wheels and engines and explosions always delighted them. Now, what does that sound like? What does that sound like? It sounds like an author who's lived through the industrial slaughter of the First World War. The Hobbit has been described as a book about entering manhood, but maybe in the end it's about much more than that. The hero in the story leaves the safety of the Hobbit hole and confronts genuine evil, right? He puts his own life at risk to help his friends, resisting the powerful temptation to slip away to safety and return home. Think about it, friends. The First World War produced a flood of writers disenchanted with the concepts of courage and sacrifice. Think of works like A Farewell to Arms, Goodbye to All That, All Quiet on the Western Front. Many authors had become cynical and consumed by the idea of lost innocence. The Hobbit is the beginning of Tolkien's reply. They shall not have the last word. C.S. Lewis is engaged in a similar literary counterattack. In 1933, he publishes a spiritual autobiography in which he exposes the ideologies that were all the rage during his years as an atheist throughout the 1920s into the 30s. The book is modeled on Bunyan's The Pilgrim's Progress, but Lewis calls it The Pilgrim's Regress because his pilgrim has to unlearn many of the assumptions of his age. Sounds like our generation right now in our high schools and colleges. They got to unlearn a lot of stuff, don't they? Lewis tackles Freudianism, materialism, fascism, communism. He argues that the radical ideologies of the left and the right are fundamentally totalitarian, forces of mass violence waiting to be unleashed. Lewis takes on the modernist movement in literature and the arts, which has embedded itself in the leading cultural institutions. In just a couple of lines, modernism. It rejects the traditional view of the human person as rational, as responsible, as a moral being. The emphasis with modernism is on the absurd, the nonsensical, the irrational. Think T.S. Eliot and The Wasteland, right? That's not Loconte's Backyard Garden, that's T.S. Eliot and The Wasteland. In a chapter entitled Freedom of Thought, Lewis skewers the intellectual and artistic set of the post-war years. He calls them the clevers. The clevers, because of their cynicism, explains a very young clever, we lost our ideals when there was a war in this country. They were ground out of us in the mud and the flood and the blood. There's no better line to describe the modernist mood. Our idealism was ground out of us, ideals, the mud, the flood, the blood. J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis deeply resent this outlook, and they decide to do something about it. Probably the end of 1936, they make a literary pact between them. A literary pact. Lewis's nickname for Tolkien was Tollers, right? He says, Tollers, there's too little of what we really like in stories. I'm afraid we shall have to try and write some ourselves. It's agreed. Tolkien will write a time travel story. Lewis will write a space travel story. Both of their stories must point the way to the great story, God's rescue mission for mankind. Now, on the face of it, this pledge might seem utterly irrelevant to the world around them. These are Oxford Dons. They're not political figures, right? Neither has published any fiction. They're unknown outside of Oxford. So what in the world they hope to accomplish? Well, whatever their objectives, we can't forget that Tolkien and Lewis are Englishmen, and they care deeply about their country and its civilization. They know there are threats all around. They resent the confused and cynical outlook that's in vogue. They must have concluded that the literary establishment could not be counted on to pierce through the fog, the moral fog, and Britain's national life, its culture, its politics, desperately needs moral clarity, so the two friends decide to do something about it. They're going to form the nucleus of a group of writers who will push back against the darkness, the Inklings. The Inklings. So what do Tolkien and Lewis do? Well, Tolkien begins but never finishes his time travel story. But in 1937, he publishes The Hobbit. Almost immediately, he begins writing the sequel, The Lord of the Rings, end of 1937. C.S. Lewis fulfills his part of the literary bargain. 1938, he publishes Out of the Silent Planet, the first book in the space trilogy. It's a story involving a trio of earthlings who travel to another planet, Malacandra, or Mars, where they encounter three different rational species, all living in harmony, right? And the story's protagonist, a guy named Elwyn Ransom, a Cambridge professor, a language guy, a philologist, obviously modeled on Tolkien. Ransom represents the rehabilitation of modern man. He's a man of faith, obedient to the good. Well, Ransom has to battle these two other travelers with him, Dick Devine, a profiteer, and Dr. Weston, a mad physicist, hell-bent on planting the human species on other planets. They meet the planet's ruling intelligence, the Oyarsa, who reveals to them a terrifying secret. His beloved home of Thulkandra, Earth, has become a cautionary tale throughout the universe. A silent planet, he tells them. Earth is a silent planet, alienated from the joy of heaven because of its rebellion against the good. Well, Lewis will describe a climactic exchange between Ransom and the Oyarsa, who wants to understand why has he come to this planet, he and his companions. What are you doing on my planet? And this is the answer that he gives them. Ransom gives him, I think Dr. Weston would destroy all your people to make room for our people. And then he would do the same with other worlds again. He wants our race to last for always, I think, and hopes they will leap from world to world. Weston would destroy one race to make room for his own. What does that sound like, ladies and gentlemen? Lewis does not need to invent this apocalyptic possibility through fiction. It's occurring on Britain's doorstep. In Hitler's Mein Kampf, the elimination of the Jewish people from Europe was essential for Germany's attainment of living space for the Aryan race, right? By the time Lewis began writing the Ransom series, this goal is already the focus of Hitler's domestic policy. Before Lewis completes the trilogy in 1945, the genocide of the Jews has become the most important cause of Nazi Germany's wars of aggression. The last book of the trilogy, That Hideous Strength, it teaches us, among other things, that without the restraint of a moral code, Government power is going to align itself with scientific and medical elites to create a totalitarian state. Let me say that again. Without the restraint of a moral order, a religious code, government power will align itself with scientific and medical elites to eliminate our freedom. What does that sound like, friends? Lewis imbues his stories with a deeply religious quality. They retell the biblical account of the fall and the cosmic struggle between the forces of light and the forces of darkness. Well, by 1938, barely 20 years after surviving what was the most devastating conflict in history, Tolkien and Lewis watch in anguish as new forces of aggression gather and dominate the landscape of Europe. I have been in considerable trouble over the present danger of war, writes C.S. Lewis to his friend Dom Griffiths in April 1938. Twice in one life, he says, and then to find how little I have grown in fortitude despite my conversion, his conversion to Christianity. October 5th, Lewis writes again to Griffiths, I was terrified to find how terrified I was by the crisis. Pray for me for courage. Writing to his publisher, October 13th, J.R.R. Tolkien also has the prospect of war on his mind. He says his new story about Middle-earth is becoming more terrifying than the Hobbits. He worries it may prove quite unsuitable for young people because it carries a more adult tone, he says. And then he says this, the darkness of the present days has had some effect on it. Well, the crisis and the darkness of which Lewis and Tolkien speak, the fear of another European war, arrives like a thunderbolt in the spring of 1938. What's the crisis of 1938, ladies and gentlemen? It's the Munich crisis. The Munich crisis. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, had left 3.5 million Germans within the borders of the newly created Czechoslovakia, right? In 1938, Hitler begins complaining about the treatment of these ethnic Germans in the Sudetenland. He demands that they be reincorporated into the Third Reich, and he's ready to go to war. So, he invites Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain to Munich September 29th to negotiate an end to the crisis. The negotiations concluded in the early morning hours of September 30th, sealed the fate of Czechoslovakia. The Sudetenland will be turned over to Germany and war will be avoided without firing a shot, without a vote, without even the presence of the Czechs at the negotiating table. They were not invited. The borders of Czechoslovakia are redrawn. Thousands of letters and telegrams pour into 10 Downing Street, congratulating the Prime Minister on his brilliant stroke of diplomacy to avoid war. But not everybody's celebrating. In a speech before the House of Commons a few days later, Winston Churchill denounces the Munich Pact as, quote, a disaster of the first magnitude. And he makes this fearsome prediction. Don't suppose this is the end. This is only the beginning of the reckoning. This is only the first sip, the first foretaste of a bitter cup, which will be proffered to us year by year, unless by a supreme recovery of moral health and martial vigor, we arise again and take our stand for freedom as in the olden time. Well, after Churchill becomes prime minister in 1940, he will play an indispensable political role in mobilizing the British people for war, yes, sustaining their war spirit over the next 5 years. But think about it, the reconstitution of moral health and martial vigor, this is a cultural task, isn't it? You can't write an executive order for this at the end of the day, right? Well, Tolkien and Lewis will take on this obligation not as wartime propagandists, but as authors and academics who believe that their scholarship, their teaching, their imaginative literature can help shake a generation loose from its moral cynicism and spiritual lethargy. And in this great task, friends, and I know this is important to this audience, they draw from deep wells, the collective wisdom of the literary canon of Western civilization. Homer, Virgil, Dante, Milton. Well, The entire future of their civilization is cast into doubt, isn't it? September 1st, 1939, when Germany invades Poland. The Polish people become the first of many victims of the Nazi blitzkrieg, the Lightning War. 2 weeks after Britain's declaration of war, J.R.R. Tolkien writes to his publisher to explain why he doesn't expect to make much progress on his new story about hobbits. Why? Here's what he said. Any far-reaching work of my own is out of the question, for I'm liable to be summoned to a job undertaken last spring at any moment. Have no idea what time, if any, outside of it I shall have. What job is he talking about? Codebreaker. Codebreaker for the British Foreign Office at Bletchley Park. Tolkien gets several days of training, but in the end, they're not going to need his services. Well, Oxford faces the possibility of massive bombing raids now, food shortages, the likelihood of a land invasion. The government begins evacuating mothers and children from London and other cities to the English countryside to escape the anticipated bombing campaign. Nearly 3 million people evacuated during the first 4 days of the Exodus. 12-year-old Lillian Hanson, an evacuee from London, captures the moment as eloquently as any journalist on the scene. Here's a few lines from Lillian. A sadder day there was never before, when all mothers, both rich and poor, stood and wept when their children went away on the great evacuation day. 4 children, all girls, appear at Lewis's home in Oxford the day after the Nazi invasion of Poland. I am a bachelor, Lewis tells his friend, Sister Penelope, and never appreciated children until the war brought them to me. Patricia Heidelberger is one of those girls, reflecting back on that time. My first impression of C.S. Lewis was that of a shabbily clad, rather portly gentleman whom I took to be the gardener and told him so. He roared, he boomed with laughter. Well, Lewis stirs an intellectual awakening in the young people who come into his home. He does. But I think their presence transforms him as well. From a confirmed bachelor who doesn't enjoy the company of children to the author of one of the most beloved series of children's books in modern fiction, the Chronicles of Narnia. War, friends. War is the spark that lights the flame of imagination. It's probably at this time in 1939, after children evacuees have become a fixture now at Lewis's home, when Lewis scribbles the opening lines of the first book of the series. Here are the lines. This book is about 4 children. They all had to go away from London suddenly because of the air raids. They were sent to stay with a very old professor who lived by himself in the country. In The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the Pevensie children flee the terrors of a world at war, right? Only to enter Narnia, where another war is being waged between the forces of light and the forces of darkness. Well, at the Council of Elrond in The Lord of the Rings, which is a war council, right, friends? A war council. Gandalf the wizard describes his encounter with Saruman, who pressed upon him a scheme to make peace with the forces of Mordor. A new power is rising, warned Saruman. Against it, the old allies and policies will not avail us at all. The only sensible course, Saruman says, is to be on the right side of the overwhelming power with the ultimate hope of directing it. Well, May 1940, with Britain now at war with Germany, with virtually all of Western Europe in Nazi hands, Britain's Foreign Secretary, Lord Halifax, takes a page out of Saruman's Book of Diplomacy, because Halifax approaches the Prime Minister now, Winston Churchill, about an offer from Mussolini to help Britain negotiate a peace with Hitler's Germany, a settlement. Neville Chamberlain, who had resigned as Prime Minister, now brought into the cabinet, is ready to consider decent terms. The international situation is desperate. May 13th, 1940, German tanks had shattered the French line, racing westward. May 27th, 1940, 200,000 British soldiers encircled at Dunkirk, 160,000 French and Belgian troops with them. Hitler's Wehrmacht is poised to annihilate them. It is at this moment, think about this now, if you're the Prime Minister, It's at this moment, while waiting for news from the beaches at Dunkirk, that Churchill listens to Halifax's plan for a negotiated peace. Go back to that line from Saruman. A new power is rising against it. The old policies will not avail us. Well, 2 days later, Winston Churchill tells his cabinet that he considered carefully whether he should enter into negotiations with Hitler. Here's what he said. I am convinced that every man of you would rise up and tear me down from my place if I were for one moment to contemplate parley or surrender. If this long island story of ours is to end at last, let it end only when each one of us lies choking in his own blood upon the ground. That, friends, is leadership. That's leadership. Winston Churchill's determination to resist Nazism at all cost, echoed in every major speech he delivered during the war. It has a transformative effect on the British people. But I think it can be discerned in the pages of The Lord of the Rings as well. Recall the Battle of the Pelennor Fields. The armies of Mordor are emboldened by their victories, ready to destroy Gondor and Rohan. But the leader of the armies of Rohan is unyielding. Here's how Tolkien writes it. Stern now is Eomer's mood, his mind clear again. He let blow the horns to rally all men to his banner that could come hither. For he thought to make a great shield wall at the last, and stand and fight there on foot till all fell, and do deeds of song on the fields of Pelennor. When Frodo and Sam journey into Mordor in their attempt to destroy the Ring of Power, they were exhausted, nearly overcome by the black skies and painful fumes. As Frodo casts himself upon the ground, Sam resolves his internal debate about what he must do. He knew all the arguments of despair and would not listen to them, Tolkien writes. His will was set, and only death would break it. Friends, this is the spirit of the British people in the summer of 1940 as they prepare for the Battle of Britain. England could not have won the war against Nazi Germany on its own. We know that. But think about it. It could have lost the war. It could have lost the war. And what if they had? What if they'd made a deal with Hitler? There would have been no Allied invasion at Normandy, no D-Day, no June 6, 1944, but the British people resisted to the end. They held on. As Gandalf once described the hobbits, soft as butter they can be, yet sometimes as tough as old tree roots. By holding on, the British people bought for America and her allies the most precious commodity available. They bought us time. Time to rid ourselves of our selfish isolationism and to find the courage and the resolve to confront the darkness. And by July of 1940, the darkness is all around them. Everything Hitler has promised the German people has come true, right? After the defeat of France, the German people are ready to follow him anywhere. So Hitler's speech to the Reichstag, July 19th, 1940, broadcast around the world, evokes the hatreds and the triumphalisms of his Nazi movement. Guess who's listening to that speech in 1940? C.S. Lewis and his physician friend, Dr. Havard. It airs over the BBC, simultaneously translated into English. They're listening to it together. It has an almost hypnotic effect. Listen to Lewis writing to his brother about it. I don't know if I'm weaker than other people, but while the speech lasts, it's almost impossible not to waver just a little. Wow. Well, what does he do with that? He hears the speech on a Friday. On Sunday, while attending Holy Trinity Church, while listening to the sermon in church, Lewis starts thinking about the devil. I don't know how bad that sermon was, but he starts thinking about the devil. Must have been a Loconte sermon or something, who knows? Well, he gets the idea for a diabolical fantasy. It's going to consist of the secret correspondence between a senior devil named Screwtape and his young novice trying to frustrate the plans of the enemy, God, secure the soul of their patient for their father in hell, Satan. He calls his book, of course, the Screwtape Letters. It's going to help establish Lewis as one of the most important Christian authors of his day. In this work of satire, we find the roots of the totalitarian temptation. Well, that's 1940. 1941 is a destitute year. It's a destitute year. America is on the sidelines, even right through 1940. At the end of 1940, the Blitz on London and all the rest of it, we've kind of given up on Great Britain. Joseph Kennedy, the U.S. ambassador to Britain, concludes in November 1940, democracy is finished in England. Finished, he says. Well, this is life. This is life for Lewis and Tolkien in 1940-41. Writing in March of 1941, Tolkien admits that his son's fear, his son is serving now with the British anti-artillery, anti-aircraft gunner, his son Michael. He admits that his son's fear that he might not survive the war is not unfounded. None of us may survive, he says. Not even Priscilla, his youngest, his daughter. I often have a sudden, horrible fear that we shall all perish. Tolkien recalls the dread that engulfed him as he left as a soldier for the Western Front in 1916. In this deeply personal letter to his son, he says this: I never expected to survive, and the intense emotion of regret, the vivid perception of the young man who feels himself doomed to die before he has said his word is with me still. A cloud, a patch of sun, a star, or often more than I could bear. Near Tolkien's home in Oxford is an RAF, Royal Air Force airfield, a training center for young pilots. Sunday afternoon, May 4th, 1941, a Whitley V bomber flying over New Marston with 3 crew members on board. Priscilla, Tolkien's daughter, is playing outside with her friends in the garden. Christopher, youngest son, tracking the plane with his telescope when they see black smoke pouring from the engines. One of its engines is misfiring, and the plane, with a full load of fuel, is struggling to maintain altitude. Tolkien's children can see it is going to crash. The plane hits the western bank of the River Cherwell, slides up Linton Road, hitting a farm cottage, exploding in a ball of black smoke. Tolkien, probably on his bicycle, rushes to the scene, joined by policemen, member of the Home Guard. Tolkien later tells his children that there were great acts of heroism by local people who braved the fire before official help arrived. All 3 crew members perish as one of the local residents, a man unnamed, climbed into the burning house to rescue a boy trapped in the upstairs room. Who was that unnamed man? I don't know. Tolkien would have been too modest to acknowledge it, but he almost certainly played a crucial role in the rescue efforts that afternoon. This is life, friends. This is life in England in 1941, the destitute year. December 7th, Japan attacks Pearl Harbor, surprise attack. The Japanese attack the British outpost of Malaya, sinking the Prince of Wales, killing 840 soldiers. Hong Kong falls on Christmas Day with reports of the rape and massacre of many civilians. So Japan is now at war with America and Great Britain. Germany, of course, quickly gets into the act, and now we've got a global conflict. Well, December 1941, Tolkien's daughter Priscilla receives a letter from Father Christmas. Father Christmas. Tolkien began writing and illustrating his Father Christmas letters to his children when they're just toddlers. The letters are usually filled with the escapades of the polar bear, the chief assistant to Father Christmas, whose comical adventures will affect the annual Christmas stock. In 1933, the letters took on a somewhat more menacing tone with the introduction of the goblins. But the Christmas letter of 1941, the goblins are front and center. Listen to what Father Christmas writes to Priscilla. I expect you remember that some years ago we had trouble with the goblins. We thought we'd settled it. Well, it broke out again, worse than it has been for centuries. Father Christmas notes that fewer children have written to him than in previous years. I expect this because of this horrible war. So terribly many people have lost their homes or have left them. Half the world seems to be in the wrong place. Merry Christmas, Priscilla, right? You can't escape it, right? Well, the war is stirring up the consolations of religion, but it's also creating doubt and despair. The director of the BBC's religious broadcasting department asks C.S. Lewis now to deliver a series of radio broadcasts defending the Christian faith. This is the BBC. Come and explain and defend the Christian faith to the nation. How far the BBC has fallen. Lewis agrees. The opening lines of his first broadcast for the BBC, August 1941, here's how he starts it. The first line, everyone has heard people quarreling. Everyone has heard people quarreling. What do we do when we quarrel? You know? What do we do when we quarrel? You promised me tickets to the Phillies game, box seat tickets, you didn't deliver, you kept them for yourself, right? We appeal to a moral standard, right? A moral standard of right and wrong. So for the next 15 minutes, from 7:45 to 8 o'clock, this former atheist, C.S. Lewis, introduces the BB audience to the concept of a universal moral law at a moment in world history when the moral foundations of Western civilization are disintegrating. Here is someone trying to reverse the rot. Well, by December of 1941, Tolkien has taken his story to the breaking of the Fellowship when Boromir, one of the company, tries to take the ring from Frodo by force. The ring gives you the ability to make yourself invisible, right? Whoever possesses the ring controls all the others. One ring to rule them all, one ring to find them, one ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them, my precious. The ring of power, right? The motive force behind Sauron's attempt to enslave or destroy any living thing that stands in his way. Listen to Tolkien. He brooked no freedom nor any rivalry. He named himself Lord of the Earth. What does that sound like, friends? It sounds like the geopolitical reality. It sounds like a literary expression of a political ideology, totalitarianism. This is the outlook that is dominating the regimes in Tokyo, Berlin, Rome, Moscow. Art is imitating life. Life is imitating art. Well, the nightmare years. Tolkien's writing throughout World War II, and part of his achievement, I think, is to begin to wrap up here. Part of his achievement is he persuades his readers that his mythology is very much like reality. It reveals the human condition, right? Man's dignity as well as his shame. But there's another aspect of Tolkien's achievement we've got to mention. Unlike any other quest story in literature, in The Lord of the Rings, the hero's supreme objective is not to endure dangers in order to secure something of great value. Instead, the terrible suspense of the story is whether these two solitary hobbits, prepared to risk all, can complete their task of destroying something of great value, the Ring of Power. Tolkien's heroes don't seek glory for themselves or their kinsmen. Their mission is one of complete renunciation of the self for a noble cause, the redemption of Middle-earth. So, what are the values and ideals we're seeing in his works? Self-denial, humility, the rejection of worldly power, the need for redemption. Think about it. In the immediate context of the Second World War, with nations on all sides equally desperate to obtain weapons of mass destruction, this message could not have been more countercultural. And I think this helps to explain why Tolkien and Lewis became such kindred spirits. Here are the threads that brought them together in friendship. They're veterans of the First World War who endured great loss early in their lives. They are writers with an imaginative life of incredible reach and richness. They are scholars nourished by the literary canon of Western civilization. They're guardians of a deep and generous Christian faith. You know, many of the young people who studied under Tolkien and Lewis during the war later recalled the sense of living through a singular moment in their lives as you read some of their essays and letters about it. Listen to Rachel Trickett. We made our way weekly through the blackouts to hear this extraordinary man, she says. Pupils who survived the combat of his tutorials, Lewis's tutorials, learned to love and rely on his humanity and loyalty and stealthy generosity. Helen Terrell attended lectures by Tolkien, was a pupil of Lewis during the war. War news was unavoidable and wrenching, but listen to Helen Wheeler. but at few times can there have been such splendidly exciting lectures and such overflowing lecture halls, she said. And then listen to this. What it meant for my generation of English language and literature undergraduates was that what happened in the great books was of equal significance to what happened in life. Indeed, that they were the same. What happened in the great books was of equal significance to what happened in life. What are these guys doing? What gift have they given their students? They've helped them to understand that the truths and ideals expressed in the great works of the classical and medieval worlds were deeply relevant to the events of the modern world, a world at war. Because for a time, friends, it really looks as if the survival of England, the survival of Western civilization, depends on the choices of quite small people who overcame their fears and fought the terror from the skies. What have these guys done? Tolkien and Lewis and their fellow Inklings. They create a beachhead of resistance against the forces of disintegration threatening the civilized world. And it might never have happened if these two men had not become friends. Walter Hooper, who was C.S. Lewis's personal secretary near the end of his life, gathered all his works together. I met Walter Hooper a few years ago before he passed. He was in his 80s. And he told me that when he spoke to Tolkien said this to Walter Hooper about The Lord of the Rings. He never wanted to write a sequel to The Hobbit, but Lewis kept persisting. So this is what Tolkien told Walter Hooper, who said it to me. You know, C.S. Lewis was such a boy. He had to have a story. And that story, The Lord of the Rings, was written to keep him quiet. I don't know how true that is, but at the end of the day, Tolkien admits he never would have finished The Lord of the Rings without Lewis's constant demands for more. Give me more, Tollers, give me more. And when he finally finishes the book, Lewis has the manuscript now for the first time. And he sends a note to his friend after reading it. And here's what he says. I've drained the rich cup. I've satisfied a long thirst. So much of your whole life, Tolkien, so much of our joint life, so much of the war, so much that seemed to be slipping away without a trace into the past is now, in a sort, made permanent. Do we even grasp what he's saying? I'm not sure I grasp what he's saying. It's an astonishing thing to say. Through the use of his imagination, Tolkien has captured something of the quality of their life's journey together. And it's hidden, friends. It's hidden in the pages of this great book. Here, I think, is what friendship can achieve when it reaches for a high purpose and it's watered by the streams of sacrifice and loyalty and love. I think there's a sublime, transcendent quality to the works of these authors that stretches across time and across cultures. That J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis could create stories of such radiance and nobility when the world around them was so dark and disfigured. This seems itself a mystery of grace. They knew what it was like to live in the land of shadow. They knew. And yet, like Sam Gamgee, on the threshold of Mordor, they pressed on through the darkness, and they left for us a bright glimpse of the far-off country. Here's how Tolkien described it. We'll close with this. There, peeping among the cloud rack, high up in the mountains, Sam saw a white star twinkle for a while, and the beauty of it smote his heart as he looked up out on the forsaken land, and hope returned to him. For like a shaft, clear and cold, the thought pierced him that in the end, the shadow was only a small and passing thing, because there was light and high beauty forever beyond its reach. Light and beauty beyond the walls of this world. May each of us find the courage and the grace and the faith to see it. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Joe. Outstanding presentation. And we have time for a few questions, if I could. And I have to tell you, I have a stack of cards over here Ellen tried to give to me, so if we don't get to yours, it's just because we don't have the time. The first question is, if the antagonists in the stories of Lewis and Tolkien reflect fascist ideology, what do their protagonists say is the solution or the remedy? Do the authors differ in their rebuttal of evil?
Terrific question. We'll take a stab at it. Just a stab at it. Think about what they're up against. A totalitarian menace. They've seen the totalitarian regimes come out of nowhere and dominate the whole European continent. Yet they persist in saying, in demanding that every individual makes a choice for the good. And that the choices of individuals, even the smallest hobbit or a mouse named Reapy-Cheep, even the smallest little creatures, have a role to play in the fight against evil, because we cannot know how our decisions are going to echo and ripple into eternity for good, right? And I think thank you for that, guys, and I think the two of them, that's part of the reason they're such good friends. They see the world the same way, that they're trying to restore the dignity of the individual, our moral choices, our moral agency. So, yeah, great question.
Next question is, advice even from the wise to the wise is a dangerous thing. How does this is a Gandalf quote, how does this apply to those charged with the making determinations to guide us with the issues in today's gathering storm?
Well, it's a big question. If I'll try to take a stab at it, friends. I'm out of my depth here. I'm just a history professor guy trying to answer these big existential questions. Let me think. You know, one of the features, the qualities of both these men, which I think speaks to this question, is humility. There's not a triumphalism among these men. Think about their stories. Frodo comes back from his quest, and he's not the same man, is he? And there's still this evil lurking. There's not a triumphalism. There's a sense of the world is a broken place. We have a role to play in trying to heal it. But there isn't a kind of militaristic triumph. There's a humility about what they have to do. The Council of Elrond in Book 1 is a great example of this. They have the ring. They have the thing that can destroy Sauron, but they can't use it, right? Because it'll destroy them. So they're walking on this uncharted territory, and it's a very similar thing for Lewis in the Space Trilogy and the Chronicles of Narnia. There's a humility about what they're up against and their own weakness. And I think ultimately a recognition that they're going to need help from the outside. This strikes me with both authors. You know, spoiler alert here, at the end of the day, Lord of the Rings. Frodo doesn't quite succeed in his quest, does he? You remember what he says? Remember what he says? I shall not do what I came to do. The ring is mine. And he puts it on his finger, and then Gollum, despicable Gollum, bites off his finger, falls into the crack of doom. In other words, what Tolkien calls a sudden, miraculous grace. Grace from the outside, despite all their strength, all their determination, all their heroism. It's not enough. They need grace from the outside. That's humility. I think that's a partial answer, at least, to the question, I hope.
Thank you. I think it's more than partial. The last question is, will fantasy literature ever shed its association in mainstream culture as being childish and unsophisticated? What will it take for serious people to take fantasy seriously?
That's a great question. That's a great question. You know, Tolkien and Lewis were accused, even at the time, and still to this day by some people, of writing this escapist literature. Escapist fantasy. Couldn't handle the hard problems of the world, so they're disappearing into Narnia or wherever they're going, or to Rivendell. And what Tolkien and Lewis both said about their works is this, I'll paraphrase, but it's pretty close, is that, you know, good fantasy, it's not escapist, not in the pejorative sense, but good fantasy, if it's deep, if it's rich, if it's rooted in something solid, what it does is it puts our minds and hearts on things that are noble and good and true and right and beautiful. No one thinking on those things is escaping reality. We need more of that kind of fantasy, right? More of that, not less of that.
Excellent. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, please thank Dr. Joe Loconte.
Thank you, guys. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, guys.